Have you ever wondered who truly profits from the debts that seem impossible to escape? Imagine a system so vast, so meticulously designed, that no matter how hard you try, the chains of financial obligation never loosen. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's a historical pattern, a legacy written by some of the most influential architects of global finance, a system where debt isn't just a number, it's a trap that keeps entire nations under control. What if I told you that the $38 trillion owed by the United States, along with the hundreds of trillions owed worldwide, isn't a mistake or an accident? It's exactly how the system was meant to work from the beginning, engineered to ensure that power and wealth flow eternally to the few who built it. The story begins centuries ago with clever minds who understood the mechanics of money and influence. Each decision, each financial innovation was designed to make repayment impossible, to make interest a perpetual extraction from the many to the benefit of the few. Governments could never fully pay off their debt because the system was designed so that every bond, every loan, every credit line would reinforce the chain, making citizens and states dependent on it forever. It's not just an economic structure, it's a power structure. And it's everywhere, affecting everything you buy, every tax you pay, every investment you make, even the very currency you hold in your hand. But here's what most people never see. While billions of ordinary people struggle to manage loans, mortgages, and personal debt, the real beneficiaries are invisible. Asset managers, central banks, investment institutions, they don't just survive this system, they thrive. Every payment of interest, every refinancing, every bailout designed to keep countries solvent feeds their wealth. And history shows us that this isn't new. It's a pattern repeated for centuries, starting with a Scottish merchant in 1694, refined by dynasties of bankers, and perfected through the modern Federal Reserve System. Every financial crisis, every economic collapse, every round of austerity is just another layer of control, another cycle reinforcing the trap. Now, here's where you need to think carefully. The decisions made hundreds of years ago are still affecting you today. The system wasn't broken. It was built to function exactly as it does, ensuring that the power never shifts, no matter the political promises or economic reforms. And while governments, presidents, and central banks may pretend to negotiate solutions, the truth is that the architecture of debt itself guarantees that ordinary people remain the source of continuous wealth extraction. Have you ever felt trapped in your finances, wondering why progress feels impossible? That feeling is not coincidence, it's by design. So I want to know from you, have you noticed this in your own life? Are you starting to see the invisible forces shaping every decision you make, every transaction you participate in? Leave a comment sharing your experience or thoughts. If this perspective is opening your eyes, make sure to like this video and check if you're already subscribed, because understanding the mechanics behind this eternal debt is the first step to seeing the bigger picture. Fica comigo até o final, because what you're about to discover next will reveal just how deep and all-encompassing this financial trap really is. The origins of perpetual debt trace back to 1694, when a Scottish merchant named William Paterson proposed a financial system that would change the world forever. At that time, England was struggling to fund wars against France, and traditional loans from merchants and nobles were insufficient. Paterson's solution was revolutionary: create a national bank, the Bank of England, which would lend money to the government in exchange for perpetual interest payments. The principal would never be repaid, and the government would commit to pay interest indefinitely. This seemingly simple innovation laid the foundation for a system where debt would become a permanent fixture of governance, turning what was once a temporary obligation into a structural mechanism of control. But Paterson's brilliance went beyond the creation of a bank. He engineered the first financial loop where government borrowing itself became a form of currency. The bonds issued by the government, backed by parliamentary authority, were not only tradable, but effectively became money. As long as England could tax its citizens, interest payments would flow to the lenders, creating a continuous and self-reinforcing transfer of wealth. This innovation not only solved the immediate financial crisis, but created a template for all future governments. Debt was no longer just a problem to be solved. It became an instrument of power, a tool to shape policy, control populations, and manipulate economies across generations. The implications of Paterson's system were profound. Governments were no longer constrained by the limits of their own resources. They could borrow endlessly, confident that there would always be buyers for their debt. At the same time, lenders were guaranteed a perpetual stream of income, independent of government performance or economic stability. This created a symbiotic relationship between bankers and states, a dependency that would only deepen over time. The system encouraged overborrowing and spending, knowing that repayment was never required, and incentivized the concentration of wealth among those who controlled the financial instruments. Over decades, this model was copied across Europe, influencing France, the Netherlands, and eventually the newly formed United States. By the early 18th century, England had set a precedent that would shape global finance for centuries. The concept of permanent interest-bearing debt became a cornerstone of imperial expansion and national policy. It allowed governments to fund wars, infrastructure, and administration without fear of default because the obligation was engineered to be endless. Citizens, on the other hand, became the unseen source of this perpetual wealth transfer, paying taxes that funded both interest and principal in a cycle designed never to end. Patterson's creation marked the birth of modern financial engineering, demonstrating that debt was not merely an economic tool, but a mechanism of long-term influence and control over entire populations. This innovation also introduced a critical psychological dimension, the illusion of solvency. Because the principal was never due, governments could maintain appearances of fiscal responsibility while continuously expanding their obligations. This deception allowed states to grow far beyond sustainable limits, funding empires, armies, and colonial ventures, all while embedding a dependency on lenders that would persist for centuries. In essence, Patterson didn't just solve a funding problem, he built the scaffolding for a system where financial leverage could dominate politics, society, and global power dynamics, a structure that still governs the flow of money today and underpins the very debt trap that shapes the modern world economy. The evolution of perpetual debt didn't stop with William Patterson. In the early 19th century, Nathan Rothschild transformed the system into a global mechanism that made default virtually impossible. The Rothschild family, strategically positioned across London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples, created a network that could move money faster than any government or traditional financial institution. This network didn't just facilitate lending, it industrialized sovereign debt, creating a web of obligations that connected nations, investors, and governments in ways that ensured financial dependence and systemic stability for creditors. Rothschild's innovation was deceptively simple: make government debt tradable across borders. Bonds could be bought, sold, and used as collateral anywhere in Europe. No longer was default a matter of failing to pay a single creditor. It would ripple across multiple nations, banks, and investors, threatening systemic collapse. This interconnectivity forced governments into a permanent cycle of borrowing, as failure to honor one obligation would endanger their entire economic and political standing. In essence, Rothschild industrialized the debt trap, turning it into an instrument of influence that could dictate policy, control territories, and even manipulate the outcome of wars. During the Napoleonic Wars, Rothschild demonstrated the full power of his system. His couriers provided him with intelligence faster than official channels, allowing him to anticipate the outcomes of battles and market reactions. By strategically buying and selling government bonds, he profited immensely while simultaneously exerting influence over governments that depended on his liquidity. This was not mere speculation. It was a form of structured financial leverage that reinforced the dependency of nations on his network. Governments learned quickly that ignoring Rothschild's market meant risking instability, and compliance became the rational choice. The broader implication of this innovation was that debt had become both a globalized and weaponized tool. Sovereign debt could no longer be treated as a local problem. Defaulting on a bond in one country could cascade into financial crises in others, creating a tightly bound system where obligations had to be maintained at all costs. For ordinary citizens, the consequences were invisible but severe. Their taxes, labor, and economic activity were continuously funneled into servicing obligations that reinforced the wealth of international financiers. The system guaranteed that power remained concentrated in the hands of those who controlled the flow of money, creating structural inequality that persists to this day. By the mid-19th century, the Rothschild model had been adopted and adapted by other banking dynasties and governments, cementing the permanence of global debt. Governments could no longer act independently. Economic decisions had to align with the expectations of creditors who now had unprecedented reach and influence. Financial engineering had evolved into a strategic apparatus, ensuring that debt payments would continue indefinitely and that lenders would retain control over national and international policy. The interconnected, tradable debt markets that Rothschild pioneered are the direct ancestors of today's complex global financial system, where sovereign obligations, institutional investments, and central bank operations maintain the illusion of stability while enforcing perpetual indebtedness across the planet. This stage of the system's evolution demonstrated a critical principle. Once debt becomes tradable, interlinked, and reliant on a network of institutional and private actors, it cannot be eliminated without triggering systemic collapse. Every nation caught in this web is compelled to borrow, pay interest, and perpetuate the cycle, often at the expense of domestic development and citizen welfare. Rothschild didn't just build a fortune, he designed a mechanism that reshaped the structure of global power, embedding dependency and control into the very fabric of international finance. By the early 20th century, the framework for perpetual debt reached a decisive stage in the United States, where financial power and government influence converged to create a system designed to endure indefinitely. After repeated financial panics and economic crises, the need for a centralized mechanism to manage national debt became undeniable. J.P. Morgan and a network of influential bankers orchestrated a solution that would consolidate control while giving the illusion of decentralized governance. This led to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, a seemingly public institution with the authority to issue currency and purchase government bonds, yet fundamentally structured to ensure that private banks maintained ultimate control over money creation and interest flows. The Federal Reserve didn't merely stabilize the banking system, it transformed it into an instrument of perpetual indebtedness. By acting as a guaranteed buyer for government debt, the Fed enabled the U.S. government to borrow without limit. Each bond issued, each note printed, fed directly into a cycle that ensured lenders, mostly the largest banks and financial institutions, would always receive their interest payments. Citizens unknowingly became participants in this system. Taxes collected, public programs funded, and everyday transactions all contributed to sustaining the continuous flow of wealth to a concentrated elite. The genius of the design was that governments could maintain appearances of solvency while the underlying obligations grew ever larger. As the decades progressed, this structure was further reinforced. Economic crises, whether caused by overextension, speculation, or global conflicts, were systematically managed to protect creditors. Bailouts, refinancing, and monetary interventions ensured that debt obligations were never canceled. The cycle was now institutionalized, unbreakable without risking catastrophic collapse. Ordinary Americans, like citizens elsewhere in the world, were paying interest on obligations that had no end, perpetually, transferring wealth upward while governments maintained the facade of fiscal responsibility. The consequences of this system extend beyond numbers on balance sheets. Societies become conditioned to a dependency where political decisions are influenced by debt service requirements rather than public need. National priorities shift toward maintaining liquidity for bondholders, often at the expense of social programs, infrastructure, and innovation. The population may see temporary growth or prosperity, but it is built on the continuous extraction of wealth through interest payments that are engineered never to end. This is why crises recur, why recessions appear inevitable, and why governments seem powerless despite appearances of authority. The evolution of global debt reached new complexity during the late 20th century when Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1979 to 1987, confronted an unprecedented economic dilemma. Inflation in the United States had surged above 10%, eroding purchasing power and threatening the stability of the financial system. Volcker's response was drastic. He raised the federal funds rate to historic highs, peaking at 20%. While this decision successfully curtailed inflation, it triggered a cascade of unintended consequences that would further entrench the global debt cycle and reshape the economic trajectory of numerous nations. Developing countries, which had borrowed extensively during periods of lower interest rates, suddenly faced an impossible burden. Mexico owed tens of billions, Brazil hundreds of billions, and Argentina similarly staggering sums, all in a currency whose cost of service had multiplied overnight. The result was immediate default risk, which, left unmanaged, could have triggered a systemic collapse affecting banks across the United States and Europe. Instead of allowing market forces to clear the debt, the solution was a coordinated intervention. The International Monetary Fund and U.S. financial institutions orchestrated a series of bailouts and restructurings, ensuring that interest payments continued and the principal remained largely untouched. This intervention established a precedent that debt would never be forgiven. It would simply be managed, rolled over, and restructured. The mechanism became a global standard. Countries facing fiscal distress were compelled to implement austerity measures, privatize state-owned enterprises, open their markets to foreign investment, and surrender elements of economic sovereignty in exchange for access to capital. In this way, debt transformed from an economic liability into a tool of influence and control, reinforcing the power of international financial institutions and embedding dependency into national policies. The consequences of these policies were profound. Economies became increasingly vulnerable to external shocks, social inequality widened, and political autonomy was constrained by obligations to lenders rather than by domestic priorities. Citizens, meanwhile, continued to bear the cost of interest payments through taxes, reduced public services, and economic instability. The debt trap, first conceptualized in 1694 and refined through Rothschild networks and Federal Reserve mechanisms, had now been fortified through global enforcement. Perpetual indebtedness was no longer just theoretical. It was actively managed, perpetuated, and guaranteed. By the 1980s, it was clear that the system had achieved a level of sophistication previously unimaginable. Financial markets were globally interlinked, debt instruments had become tradable across borders, and central banks had the power to stabilize or manipulate markets at will. Governments could neither default nor disengage without triggering crises that would affect their citizens, neighboring nations, and international investors simultaneously. The result was a world in which debt was not simply an economic challenge, but a structural feature, a permanent framework of control, and a mechanism for transferring wealth upward to institutions and individuals who orchestrated the system. This stage solidified the principle that no nation could escape the global financial network without incurring severe consequences. Debt was no longer a short-term obligation, but a permanent, inescapable component of governance, a reality that would continue to shape economic policy, societal development, and global power dynamics well into the 21st century. Today, the system of perpetual debt has reached a scale that would have been unimaginable to its original architects. The United States alone owes more than $38 trillion, a figure that represents only a portion of the global debt, which now exceeds $315 trillion. But what's most striking is not the sheer magnitude, but how this debt is structured and who ultimately benefits from it. Much of it is owed internally to institutions, trust funds, and central banks, while the remainder circulates internationally through sovereign obligations, bonds, and complex financial instruments. The system ensures that interest payments flow continuously to financial institutions, asset managers, and banks, creating a vast, self-reinforcing transfer of wealth that bypasses ordinary citizens entirely. The architecture of this debt is deliberately designed to prevent any resolution. Principal repayment is optional in practice because the government can always issue new bonds, roll over obligations, and rely on central banks to maintain demand for debt instruments. In effect, the system converts the liability into a permanent source of profit for those controlling the flow of money. Every refinancing, every interest payment, every government intervention reinforces the cycle. Citizens may perceive economic fluctuations, recessions, or inflation as isolated events, but they are in fact byproducts of a system meticulously engineered to preserve the wealth and influence of a small financial elite. Global interconnections make the system even more inescapable. U.S. treasuries are held by international institutions, Japanese bonds by domestic banks, European sovereign debt by a combination of public and private investors, and developing nations are often forced to restructure their obligations through mechanisms like IMF loans. This creates a web where each nation's solvency depends on maintaining confidence in others, and where any attempt to escape the debt cycle risks systemic destabilization. The debt is not only perpetual, it is interdependent, making the global financial system resilient for creditors and fragile for citizens. Furthermore, the invisible hand guiding this architecture ensures that crises, whether localized or global, reinforce the system rather than threaten it. Bailouts, emergency interventions, and interest restructuring are designed to prevent defaults while guaranteeing that payments continue. The outcome is a financial ecosystem in which governments are perpetually indebted, citizens continuously fund interest obligations, and institutional investors capture vast, unending streams of wealth. For them, the system is perfectly predictable, stable, and profitable. For everyone else, it imposes constraints on social mobility, economic opportunity, and national sovereignty. This reality highlights a critical truth. The debt system is not accidental. It is deliberate, sophisticated, and self-sustaining. Every policy decision, interest adjustment, and financial innovation builds upon centuries of precedent, from Patterson's Bank of England to Rothschild's global network and the Federal Reserve's infinite liquidity. Ordinary citizens and even governments operate within constraints set by a system they did not design, one that perpetuates financial dependency while concentrating power and wealth in the hands of a few. Understanding this is crucial because the mechanisms that govern these debts influence every economic, political, and social decision shaping the world we live in today. The consequences of this eternal debt system extend far beyond numbers on balance sheets. Ordinary citizens bear the weight of interest payments, while wealth continues to concentrate in the hands of institutions and elite investors. Social inequality has widened dramatically, and the ability of governments to implement policies that benefit the public is constrained by the need to maintain the flow of debt service. Education, healthcare, infrastructure, and social programs are often sacrificed or delayed because funds are diverted to interest payments on obligations that will never end. The cycle is self-reinforcing. The richer the financial institutions become, the more they control policy, and the more dependent citizens and governments are on the system. At the same time, the debt trap acts as a tool of global influence. Countries that cannot meet their obligations are often compelled to follow the economic prescriptions of international lenders, which include austerity measures, privatization of national assets, and opening markets to foreign investment. While these interventions are presented as necessary solutions, they ensure that the sovereignty of indebted nations is diminished and the wealth extraction continues uninterrupted. Ordinary citizens are left paying for the mistakes, strategies, and profit motives of a system engineered over centuries to protect the interests of the few at the expense of the many. The social and economic effects are deeply felt. Public trust erodes as citizens perceive inequality and corruption, yet lack the means to influence the structures controlling wealth. Economic crises are normalized, not eliminated, and each cycle reinforces the dominance of financial institutions over government policy. Even when reforms are attempted, the fundamental structure of the system remains intact, ensuring that interest flows upward and debt remains perpetual. The result is a global society where freedom and prosperity are limited by obligations that no individual or nation can fully escape, reinforcing dependency and systemic control. The architecture of debt not only dictates contemporary economic policy, but also mirrors historical patterns of financial control and collapse. Across centuries, civilizations have encountered the same dynamics when wealth becomes concentrated in the hands of a few who control credit, and when debt is used to manipulate nations and societies. The result is predictable: dependency, economic distortion, and cyclical crises. From early European empires to modern nation-states, the mechanisms have evolved, but the underlying principle remains unchanged. Those who control money wield power, and those who are indebted are constrained. This is the hidden continuity between past and present financial systems. Throughout history, governments that relied heavily on debt often found themselves constrained in foreign policy, domestic spending, and social development. The same pattern that allowed William Paterson to create perpetual debt in England and Nathan Rothschild to globalize it has manifested repeatedly. Nations are encouraged or forced to borrow, which binds them to obligations that restrict freedom and reinforce hierarchical financial structures. Each wave of borrowing may appear temporary or necessary, but once debt compounds and obligations intersect internationally, the system becomes self-sustaining, leaving countries with no practical escape without severe consequences. Modern examples illustrate how these historical lessons persist. Nations that attempt to resist the debt cycle or fail to meet their obligations are subjected to economic pressures, political interventions, or structural adjustments that enforce compliance. International financial institutions ensure that interest continues to flow, principal is maintained through refinancing, and wealth extraction. Proceeds uninterrupted. As a result, economic decisions are rarely made independently. Policies must accommodate the invisible architecture of perpetual debt. Social programs, public investment, and citizen well-being often take a back seat to the imperative of maintaining solvency for the sake of creditors, perpetuating inequality and dependence. This global entanglement ensures that even prosperous countries remain trapped in a cycle of obligation. U.S. Treasuries, European bonds, Japanese debt, and emerging market obligations are all interlinked in a complex web where default anywhere triggers instability everywhere. Each country, regardless of size or resources, becomes dependent on continuous borrowing and market confidence, reinforcing the power of financial institutions and ensuring that the structure persists. The system, though complex, is fundamentally simple in its logic. Perpetual indebtedness guarantees perpetual control. Understanding this connection between historical patterns and modern debt is crucial. It reveals that what may appear as isolated financial crises, austerity measures, or economic instability is, in fact, the predictable operation of a system engineered to maintain wealth concentration and political leverage. Ordinary citizens, despite being the ultimate source of repayment, remain largely unaware of how deeply these mechanisms shape global decisions and limit national sovereignty. The cycle of dependency, inequality, and influence continues, reflecting centuries of refinement in the enduring principles of financial control. The role of institutions and global banks in perpetuating the system of debt cannot be overstated. These organizations function as both architects and enforcers of the financial order, ensuring that the mechanisms of wealth transfer remain uninterrupted. Asset managers, central banks, investment firms, and international lenders operate in a coordinated but often opaque network, controlling the issuance, distribution, and servicing of debt across nations. Their influence extends beyond simple financial transactions, shaping policy, guiding economic priorities, and effectively dictating the choices available to governments and citizens alike. Modern institutions have perfected the methods pioneered by Paterson, Rothschild, and Morgan centuries ago. The Federal Reserve ensures continuous demand for government bonds. Central banks coordinate internationally to maintain liquidity and private ease-up. Financial institutions benefit from interest flows that are guaranteed and practically infinite. When crises occur, these entities intervene to prevent default, restructure debt, or roll over obligations, preserving the system and reinforcing their control. This networked structure creates resilience for the creditors while maintaining a perpetual cycle of indebtedness for governments and citizens. Ordinary taxpayers, pension funds, and insurance contributors collectively service obligations that funnel wealth upward, largely invisible and difficult to resist. The global reach of these institutions amplifies the impact of debt. Bonds issued by one country can be owned by investors across multiple continents, creating interdependency that ensures compliance. If a government defaults or attempts to reduce obligations, systemic risks emerge, potentially destabilizing financial markets worldwide. This interconnectedness enforces discipline and preserves the flow of capital to creditors, while citizens and domestic economies bear the consequences. Debt becomes not just a financial obligation, but a tool for maintaining influence, shaping economic behavior, and controlling national decision-making. Additionally, these institutions influence monetary policy, interest rates, and regulatory frameworks, aligning national economies with their operational objectives. By managing liquidity, providing bailouts, and shaping credit availability, they maintain the conditions necessary for debt to be perpetual. The result is a sophisticated, multi-layered system in which governments appear to have autonomy, yet their financial and political decisions are constrained by the imperatives of maintaining solvency within a network designed for endless repayment. This ongoing orchestration demonstrates that debt is more than an economic problem. It is a structural mechanism of global control. Governments, regardless of ideology or size, remain participants in a cycle from which there is no practical escape. Every policy, reform, or financial intervention must align with the demands of creditors and the structure of the international financial system. Understanding the scope of institutional influence reveals how deeply entrenched the debt system is, how it perpetuates inequality, and why no nation or individual truly operates outside its constraints. Looking ahead, the future of this eternal debt system is both inescapable and transformative. The mechanisms built over centuries, from Patterson's Bank of England to Rothschild's global networks, from Morgan's Federal Reserve innovations to Volcker's interventions, have created a framework that shapes every financial decision, every government policy, and every citizen's economic reality. The debt never disappears, interest payments never cease, and wealth continues to concentrate upward, reinforcing the cycle and ensuring that the system operates exactly as designed. Even emerging markets with their vast resources and growing populations are woven into this network, dependent on loans, bonds, and credit mechanisms that perpetuate the obligations indefinitely. For nations, the implications are profound. Sovereignty is often constrained by the need to maintain credibility with creditors, balance trade, and service debt. Domestic policies are influenced by international expectations, and social programs may be curtailed to ensure liquidity for lenders. Citizens, meanwhile, remain the invisible source of wealth extraction, funding interest payments through taxes and economic activity. The cycle ensures that financial stability exists for institutions, while societies bear the cost of maintaining it, creating a global system where perpetual indebtedness is normalized, accepted, and reinforced at every level. Yet awareness is a powerful tool. Understanding the architecture of eternal debt allows individuals to recognize the patterns, anticipate the pressures that shape economic and political decisions, and grasp the forces behind recurring crises. It reveals that what may appear as economic mismanagement, inflation, or recession is often a predictable outcome of a system designed to maintain control, influence, and wealth concentration. The more people comprehend this framework, the better they can navigate its effects and make informed decisions, both personally and collectively. If you followed this journey and it has opened your eyes, consider leaving a comment with a phrase that reflects your realization, something like, "This message was for me," or "I see it clearly now." Share your thoughts on how this understanding changes your perspective. If this content has helped you see the hidden structure behind global finance, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can continue exploring these revelations. And there's more to uncover. There's another video that complements this discussion, one that dives even deeper into how these systems influence nations and individuals alike. Click and continue with me there to fully grasp the scope and impact of eternal debt.